The attorney's hand was steady when he slid the document across the conference table. Mine was not. I remember the sound of rain against the tall windows of that old colonial house, the same house where I had spent 12 years being invisible, 12 years being the one whose name nobody called unless there was something heavy to carry or a chore nobody else wanted to do. The storm had knocked out 2 of the floodlights out front, and the only thing illuminating that long mahogany table was a single brass lamp in the corner, its glow casting everything in amber and shadow. There were 7 people in that room. My mother, my 2 older brothers, Marcus and Daniel, my Aunt Renata, who had driven 3 hours in the rain, my cousin Beau, who had taken a red-eye from Phoenix, my Uncle Greg, who had barely looked at me when he walked in, and me, Eleanor Ashworth, the one they had all quietly agreed, over years and years of small moments, did not really matter. And then the attorney, a man named Harold Finch, cleared his throat. He said, "I'm going to read the final and executed will of Raymond Clarence Ashworth, dated 14 months ago." He adjusted his glasses. He looked at no one in particular, and then he started to read. "I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened in that room. I want you to understand what the years before it felt like, because if you don't know where I started, the ending won't mean what it meant to me. And trust me, by the time this story is over, you are going to want to know every single detail. So let me ask you 3 questions. Why would a grandfather, a man of considerable wealth and property, leave everything, and I mean everything, to the one grandchild his own family had spent over a decade dismissing? What was he watching all those years while everyone else looked right through me? And what did he know about my family that they didn't know he knew? Stick with me, because the answers are going to change the way you think about what it means to be seen. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a quick reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, enjoy the rest of the video. Let me take you back, all the way back to the house on Sycamore Ridge Road, where I grew up. It was a decent house, 4 bedrooms, a big backyard, a front porch my mother never used because she said it attracted neighbors. My father had left when I was 4, and my mother had raised the 3 of us on her own, which is the version of the story she told everyone, the version that made her the hero. What she left out was the part where Marcus, the oldest, was given every resource the family had: his football gear, his class trip to Washington, his car, a second-hand Honda, bought for his 16th birthday. Then Daniel, the middle one, got the next layer: the trips to see colleges, the help with his application essays, the new laptop for his junior year of high school. Then there was me. I was 7 years younger than Marcus, and 4 years younger than Daniel, and by the time I was in middle school, I understood something in my bones, even if I didn't have words for it yet. I understood that the attention had been distributed, and I had not been in the room when they handed it out. My school clothes came from a bin at the church sale, not because we were poor. My mother worked as a branch manager at the county bank by the time I was 12, and Marcus and Daniel always had what they needed. It was something more complicated and harder to name. I was the afterthought, the one who didn't ask for much, and so received nothing. I remember one particular afternoon, I must have been about 10, sitting at the kitchen table with a permission slip for a 6th grade science camp. It cost $60. I slid it across the table to my mother, who was on the phone. She looked at it, made a face I couldn't interpret, and went back to her call. I waited. She hung up 20 minutes later, walked past me, and said she'd look at it later. She never did. I didn't go to science camp. I told my teacher I had a stomach thing. The coffee smell in that kitchen, the particular dark roast my mother always brewed, became for me the smell of waiting, of being almost seen and then not. I can still bring it up if I close my eyes. Here is the first thing you need to understand about my grandfather, Raymond Ashworth. He was not a warm man, at least not in the way you picture when you hear the word grandfather. He did not bounce children on his knee. He did not come to birthday parties. He lived 40 minutes away in that colonial house on Harwick Lane, the one with the iron gate that was always half open, the one with the wraparound porch and the shutters that had faded from black to gray over the years. He was a man who had made his money in commercial real estate over 4 decades, who had outlived his wife by 9 years, and who spoke in complete sentences when he spoke at all. My mother considered him difficult. Marcus called him the old statue. Daniel said he gave him the creeps. But something happened when I was about 12 at a family Easter gathering that I have never forgotten. I was helping clear the dishes because I was always helping clear the dishes, because no one had to ask me, because I had learned to be useful so that I would at least be present. And I walked into the dining room, and my grandfather was sitting alone at the end of the table, the rest of the family having moved to the living room. He was looking at a small framed photograph he'd taken from his breast pocket. I almost apologized and backed out, but he looked up and said, "Eleanor, sit down." I sat. He looked at me for a long moment, the way adults rarely looked at children, like he was actually measuring something. Then he said, "You notice things, don't you? You watch." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He put the photograph back in his pocket. "That's a skill," he said. "Don't let anyone take it from you." Then my mother called from the other room, and I left. And I spent the next 12 years thinking about that conversation more often than I probably should have. Here's the clock that was ticking even then, though I didn't know it. My grandfather was already in the early stages of a condition that would slow his body, but not, it turned out, his mind. He had perhaps 15 years left, and he was going to use every one of them. The question was what exactly he had already decided, and why. I didn't know it then. But something small happened at that Easter dinner that would matter enormously later. My grandfather, when I sat with him, had been looking at his personal address book, one of those old-fashioned leather ones with the gold clasp. When he put the photograph away, he also made a small notation in the book. I didn't see what he wrote, but I remembered the book. And one day, a decade later, I would think about it again. The inciting incident, the thing that cracked everything open, came on a Thursday in November, 12 years after I had left home for college and built a life in a different city. I was living in a rental apartment, working as an administrative coordinator at a small architecture firm. I was 31 years old. I had done everything myself: my student loans, my rent, my groceries, my car payment. My mother had not given me $1 since I turned 18, and to be honest, I had come to a strange kind of peace with that. I had stopped waiting for something that was never coming. And then a certified letter arrived. I remember the weight of it. The return address was an attorney's office, Finch and Greer, attorneys at law, Harwick County. I stood in my hallway in my work clothes, holding it, the late afternoon light coming through the transom window above my door. My hands were already doing something, not shaking exactly, more like bracing. The letter informed me that my grandfather, Raymond Clarence Ashworth, had died 11 days earlier. He had suffered a cardiac event at home. He was 81 years old. And then the letter said something that made me sit down on the floor of my hallway. It said that I had been named in his will and that my presence was requested at the reading, to be conducted at the family home on Harwick Lane on the first Saturday of December, 22 days from the date of the letter. I had not known he was sick. I had not known he had died. No one had called me. I sat on that floor for a long time. I thought about that Easter afternoon, that address book, the way he had looked at me and said, "You notice things." I thought about the 11 days that had passed since his death, during which my mother, my brothers, my aunt and uncle had all known, had all presumably spoken to each other, had presumably made arrangements and attended a funeral, and no one had picked up a phone. No one had called me. I want you to understand what that felt like. Not the grief exactly, though there was grief, and it was more complicated and more genuine than I would have expected. What I mean is the particular weight of confirmation, the thing you have suspected your whole life, the thing you have argued yourself out of believing because believing it fully feels too large to carry. And then one day, the universe hands you the evidence and you can't argue anymore. I had not been called because I did not exist to them in any real way. I was background, furniture, the one who was always there and never counted. And now apparently something was different. Something had shifted, and I did not yet know what. I called my mother the next morning. She answered on the 4th ring, which meant she had seen my name and considered not picking up. "Eleanor," she said, flat, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Mom." I had rehearsed this. I had sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me, and I had thought through what I wanted to say. I got a letter from a lawyer about Grandpa's estate. A pause. Yes, he died 11 days ago. Yes. Nobody called me, Mom. Another pause. Longer. It was very sudden. We were all overwhelmed. I had promised myself I would not do this on the phone. I had promised myself I would save everything for the right moment, with the right people, in the right room. So I breathed out, slowly, and I said, I'll be there for the reading. December 1st. She said, That's fine. And then, Eleanor, I want you to know that the estate is complicated. Your grandfather had debts. There's probably not much left. I let that sentence sit there. I said, I'll be there December 1st. And I hung up. She had told me there was nothing. She had said it casually, almost helpfully, like she was saving me a trip. And in that moment, I understood something that I would not fully understand until the reading itself. She was afraid. For the first time in my memory, my mother was trying to manage me. Not ignore me, manage me. Which meant she already knew something about the will that I didn't. The question was what? I drove to Harwick County the Friday before the reading, the night before the family was set to gather. I got there in the early evening, and I went straight to one place, not the house on Harwick Lane, not to see any family. I drove to the small office building on the edge of downtown where Harold Finch had his practice. I had called ahead. Harold Finch was my grandfather's attorney and had been for 30 years. He was also, it turned out, a decent man. He agreed to meet me for 30 minutes before office hours, the morning of the reading. He poured me coffee from an old percolator that smelled like it had been running since 1987. He was a compact, careful man in his late 60s with a white mustache and very still hands, and he looked at me over the rim of his glasses with what I can only describe as quiet respect. He said, Your grandfather spoke of you often, more than you might realize. I felt something shift in my chest. He did? He kept notes, Harold said, on all of you, but on you particularly. He did not tell me what the notes said. He said that would come out in the reading. But he told me something else, something practical and important, and that was this. The estate was not simple, and there were documents I would need to be prepared for, and I should under no circumstances sign anything in that room without having read it fully. He pushed a business card across the table to me. My cell, he said. Whatever happens tomorrow, you call me directly. Don't let anyone tell you what you're entitled to. I drove to a motel on the edge of town and lay awake most of that night. The rain had started around midnight, a cold, mid-November kind of rain that sounded like someone dragging a broom across the roof. 22 days I had been counting, from the date of the letter to the date of the reading. 22 days of not knowing what was inside that will. 22 days of my mother not calling again, of Marcus not reaching out, of Daniel being silent. 22 days of carrying something that felt enormous and unnamed. Tomorrow, I would find out what it was. They were already there when I arrived, all of them. The cars were lined up in the gravel drive outside the colonial house on Harwick Lane. My mother's sedan, Marcus's truck, Daniel's SUV, Aunt Renata's station wagon, a rental that must have been Beau's, Uncle Greg's old Cadillac. 7 cars, and then mine, pulling in through the half-open iron gate as the rain thickened. The house smelled of old wood and something faintly floral, like sachets left in a drawer for too long. The wallpaper in the front hall was the same as I remembered from childhood, a faded William Morris pattern in sage and cream, peeling slightly at the upper corners. I had always loved that wallpaper. My grandfather had told me once that his wife had chosen it, that she had driven 2 counties over to find it. He'd said it like it was important, like the choosing of it had mattered. I was the last to arrive, and when I walked into the dining room, the shift was immediate. Marcus looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him before. Not dismissal, something closer to wariness. Daniel was on his phone and looked up, and his eyes flicked to our mother, a quick animal check, before he nodded at me. Aunt Renata gave me a hug that lasted half a second too long and smelled of cigarettes and floral perfume. Uncle Greg said nothing. Beau, my cousin, gave me a genuine smile. He had always been the least calculated of the group, and said, Eleanor, it's good to see you. My mother was standing at the end of the table near Harold's seat. She was wearing a dark navy blazer over a white blouse, her silver hair pulled back. She looked composed. She looked like a woman who had a plan. She said, We weren't sure you were coming, and the we in that sentence landed somewhere I filed away for later. I said, "I told you I would be," and I sat down. Harold Finch arrived 8 minutes later, shaking rain from his coat. He set a leather briefcase on the table and extracted a manila folder. He said the things attorneys say at the beginning, that this was the last will and testament, that he had personally witnessed its execution, that the document before him was legally binding. He adjusted his glasses, and then he read. The opening paragraphs were standard. Debts to be paid, expenses to be settled. Then came the first real moment. My grandfather had left his personal effects, his books, his watches, a collection of first editions he'd accumulated over 40 years, to be divided among his children, meaning my mother and Aunt Renata and Uncle Greg. That was expected. I saw my mother's shoulders relax slightly. Then Harold read the next section, and the room changed. The house, the Colonial on Harwick Lane, which had been appraised at just under $1.2 million, was to be transferred in full to Eleanor Marie Ashworth. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then my mother said, "I'm sorry, what?" Harold continued. The investment accounts, 3 of them, totaling just under $900,000, were to be transferred to Eleanor Marie Ashworth. The commercial property in the county business district, which generated rental income, was to be transferred to Eleanor Marie Ashworth, with the provision that the existing tenants' leases be honored. Harold kept reading. My mother had gone the color of the wallpaper. Marcus had put both hands flat on the table. Daniel had stopped looking at his phone. When Harold was finished, the total picture was this. Raymond Clarence Ashworth had left the overwhelming majority of his estate, the house, the investments, the property, to me, to the one who hadn't been called when he died, to the one who had driven to her own grandfather's will, reading in a car with a cracked windshield and a rattle in the exhaust that she'd been meaning to get fixed, to the background, the furniture, the afterthought. And then Harold said, "There is also a letter from Raymond, addressed to Eleanor, to be read privately at her discretion." He slid it across the table, a cream-colored envelope, sealed. My name written in my grandfather's handwriting, which I recognized from a birthday card he'd sent me when I was 17. The only birthday card he had ever sent me. I picked it up. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. And then my mother said, "This is wrong. This is clearly wrong." He was not of sound mind. The next 2 hours were the worst 2 hours of my adult life. My mother did not raise her voice. That was not her style. She spoke in the clipped, controlled tone she reserved for situations where she believed she was absolutely right and everyone else was failing to keep up. She said that my grandfather had been in cognitive decline. She said that Harold Finch should be aware that there were witnesses who would attest to this. She said the word undue influence twice, which I recognized as a legal term because I had spent the past 3 weeks reading everything I could find about estate law. Marcus said, "Elle, look, I don't know what you said to him, but this isn't right, and you know it," what I said to him. As if I had engineered this, as if I had conducted some long campaign of manipulation against a man I had seen perhaps 11 times in the last decade. Daniel said nothing, which was somehow worse. Daniel just looked at me with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating, like he was running new math in his head and didn't like the answer. Aunt Renata cried, which I did not expect. She didn't say I had done anything wrong. She just cried, quietly, into a tissue and kept saying, "Raymond, Raymond," in a way that made me feel briefly, terribly guilty. Uncle Greg said flatly, "We'll contest it." Harold Finch remained extraordinarily calm. He said the will had been executed 14 months prior, that he had personally assessed my grandfather's legal capacity at the time of signing, that 2 independent witnesses had been present, and that the document was fully enforceable. He said anyone who wished to pursue a contest was welcome to do so through the proper legal channels, and that he was happy to provide referrals. And then he looked at me, and in his expression I saw something that held me steady. He had been expecting this. He had known this would happen. And he had been prepared for it because my grandfather had been prepared for it. I did not speak for most of those 2 hours. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I looked at the cream-colored envelope with my name on it, and I let my family say what they needed to say. I let my mother build her case out loud, let Marcus grow louder and then quieter as the reality landed, let Daniel do his silent arithmetic. I sat in that amber lamplight with the rain against the windows, and I waited. That had always been my skill, waiting, watching. And I understood, sitting in that room, that my grandfather had known it too. I did not read the letter that night, not in the house. I drove back to the motel, and I sat at the small desk by the window, with the rain still going, and the parking lot light making a yellow square on the wall, and I held the envelope for a long time. I thought about a woman I had become close to in the last year, a colleague at the architecture firm named Deb, who was 62 and had been through 2 divorces and a bout with cancer, and was the most sensible person I had ever met. She had a habit of saying, when I called her in moments of overwhelm, "Tell me what you know for certain, not what you feel, what you know." What I knew for certain, sitting in that motel room, my grandfather had changed his will 14 months ago. He had done so of his own volition, with legal counsel and witnesses. He had left nearly everything to me, and he had written me a letter. What I felt, like the floor had shifted, like I was standing on something that had been underground my whole life and had just surfaced, like I was afraid to open the envelope, because whatever was inside, it was going to make me cry in a way I had not let myself cry in a very long time. I called Deb. It was late, but she picked up on the second ring. I said, "The will was real. It was all real." She said, "I know." I said, "They're going to fight it." "Of course they are," she said. "That's what people do when they're ashamed and afraid." A pause. "Have you opened the letter?" "Not yet." "Open it when you're ready," she said. "Not before." I sat for another hour, and then I opened it. My grandfather's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades drafting contracts and correspondence. The letter was 4 pages long. It was dated 14 months ago, the same day as the will. I am not going to read you every word. Some of it belongs to me, but I will tell you the parts that mattered. He began, "Eleanor, I am not a man who explains himself easily, and I have left too many things unsaid for too long. This letter is an attempt to correct that, though I know it comes late." He wrote that he had watched me my entire life, not in a constant, attentive way. He acknowledged he had not been that kind of grandfather, but he had paid attention. He wrote that he had noticed at that Easter dinner when I was 12 that I was the one who cleared the dishes without being asked, that I sat with him without being told to, that I looked at him when he spoke instead of looking for an exit. He wrote that over the years he had received reports, and here he used that word deliberately, from Harold Finch, who had done occasional work that brought him into contact with my family's finances. He had known about the science camp permission slip. He had known about my mother's refusal to co-sign my first student loan. He had known about the birthday that passed in my 19th year when no one in my family acknowledged it. Not because anyone told him, because he had asked. He had asked Harold to keep a quiet eye, and Harold had. He wrote, "I want to be clear that your mother loves her children, but love is not the same as attention, and attention is not the same as equity. You were shorted, Eleanor. Year after year, in the small currency of daily life, you were shorted, and I watched it, and I did not intervene when I should have, and that is my failure as much as anyone's. This is my imperfect correction." He wrote about the address book. He said that at Easter dinner when I was 12, after I left the table, he had written my name in it with a single word beside it, "Seize." He had left the estate to me, he wrote, because he had watched me build a life without any of the help that had been given to the others, because he believed in the principle that those who have done without should not be required to continue doing without when there is something to give, and because, he wrote, he had come to believe that I was the only one of his grandchildren who would not mistake money for love and would not be undone by it. He closed with, "I am sorry I did not say more, in person, while I had the chance. I am telling you now, as clearly as I know how, you were always seen, not by everyone, but by me. That has to count for something." I sat with that letter for a long time after I finished reading it. The rain had stopped at some point, and I hadn't noticed. The parking lot outside was very quiet. I thought, he wrote my name in an address book, and he wrote "Seize" beside it, and he spent the next 20 years paying attention. I thought about all the mornings I had gotten up early and made my own lunch and walked to school because the car was taken by whoever needed it. I thought about the college applications I had filled out alone, in my bedroom, with a library book about financial aid. I thought about calling Deb from a parking lot when I got my first real job, because there was no one in my family I could call. I thought, he knew. He knew the whole time. And then I thought something else, something colder. If he had been watching, if Harold had been keeping that quiet eye, then there were records. There were records of things that went beyond simple favoritism, things that involved my grandfather's money and my family's access to it over the years. I picked up Harold Finch's business card, and I looked at it for a long moment, and then I called him. I want to tell you about a period of about 4 weeks between the reading and what I'm going to call the reckoning. Because what happened in those 4 weeks is important, and because it contains the thing that I think, still, even now, is the most painful part of this story. The day after the reading, my mother called me. Not angry, not the clipped control voice, soft, conciliatory. She said she wanted to have breakfast with me before I drove home, that she thought we had gotten off on the wrong foot, that she wanted to understand what I was going to do with the estate, that she loved me. She had never, in my adult life, called me to say that she loved me. I met her at a diner on Route 9, a booth by the window, the smell of maple syrup and hash browns, the Tuesday morning quiet of a place that filled up on weekends and breathed out the rest of the week. She was already there when I arrived, and she was wearing a different face than the one from the night before. Softer, careful. She ordered coffee and said, "Eleanor, I've been thinking. Your grandfather was an eccentric man. He had ideas about things that the rest of us didn't always understand. I don't think he meant for this to divide the family." I sipped my coffee and waited. "There's a practical solution," she said. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "This is what we think is fair." I looked at it. It was a handwritten breakdown. The house to be sold, the proceeds divided among all 4 grandchildren equally, the investment accounts split among my mother, Aunt Renata, and Uncle Greg, the commercial property sold, and proceeds split. Essentially, my grandfather's will dissolved. "We think," she said, "that if you love this family, you'll see that this is the right thing." There it was. If you love this family. I looked at my mother's face, and I want to be very precise here, because I don't want to get this wrong. I didn't feel rage. I felt something older and more complicated than rage. I felt the 12-year-old girl with the science camp permission slip. I felt the 19-year-old with the unacknowledged birthday. I felt the 31-year-old who had driven to her grandfather's will, reading in a car with a cracked windshield, because she had been managing a loan for so long that a cracked windshield was just a Tuesday. And I felt something else, something that surprised me. I felt sorry for my mother, not in the patronizing way, in the real way, because she was sitting across from me using the language of love to describe a transaction, and she didn't seem to know that those were 2 different things. I said, "Mom, I'm not signing anything right now." Her face shifted, just slightly. "Eleanor, I'm going to take some time, and I'm going to talk to Harold, and then I'll be in touch." I left $20 on the table for the coffee, and I walked out. The paper she had slid across the table, the handwritten breakdown, was sitting in my purse. I had taken it, not because I was going to sign it, because it was a document, and Harold Finch had told me to keep every document. What Harold Finch told me, in his office 2 days later, changed everything I thought I understood about the previous decade. He sat across from me at his desk with a second folder, thicker than the one from the reading, and he said, "Your grandfather asked me to hold this for you, for after the reading, he said you would need it." Inside the folder were records, careful, organized, documented records. The first set showed that over a period of 9 years, my grandfather had made a series of financial gifts to members of the family. These were not unusual. Wealthy grandparents often helped their children. But what the records showed was the pattern of those gifts, and that pattern was startling. My mother had received 3 separate cash transfers totaling $140,000 for purposes that were described in writing as home improvement, debt consolidation, and emergency fund. The home improvement transfer had been made the same year her kitchen was renovated, a renovation I had seen in a photograph she had sent to the family group text that I was not in. The debt consolidation had come during a period when, according to a note in the file, Marcus's business was struggling and my mother had co-signed something she needed to be released from. Marcus had received a direct transfer of $40,000 toward what was described as a business investment. Daniel had received $30,000 for a real estate opportunity. There was no record of any financial gift to me, ever, not a dollar. I had known I wasn't helped. I had not known I was the only one who wasn't helped. And then Harold showed me the second section of the folder, and I understood why he had told me to call him directly no matter what happened. Among the records was a copy of a promissory note, signed by my mother, 5 years earlier, for $50,000 borrowed from my grandfather's personal account, with a repayment schedule that had never been honored. The note had been forgiven in the estate. My grandfather had written it off, which was legal and his to do. But the forgiveness was conditioned on disclosure, meaning my mother was obligated to disclose the forgiven debt in the estate proceedings. She had not disclosed it. That's an omission, Harold said carefully. That could have legal consequences. I looked at the promissory note. My mother's signature was clean and decisive, the signature of a woman who had been confident she was dealing with someone who would never call her on it. I thought he knew. My grandfather had known she would not disclose it, and he had given Harold the folder for me because he had known I would need it. I thought, this is what he meant by records. I said, what are my options? Harold said, that depends on what you want. I drove back to my apartment that Friday, 3 weeks after the reading. The cracked windshield caught the afternoon light in a way that split it into colors, and I drove through that fragmented light for 200 miles, thinking about what I wanted. Marcus had called 3 times since the reading. The calls had shifted in tone. The first one frustrated, demanding, entitled. The second one more measured, more strategic. The third one, just 3 days before I drove home, oddly humble. He said, Eleanor, I just want to talk. I did not call him back. Daniel had sent an email. It was long and carefully worded, and it used the phrase, as a family, 4 times. It acknowledged, obliquely, that things had perhaps been unequal growing up. It did not use the word sorry. It suggested that the estate could be restructured in a way that honors Grandpa's intentions while keeping the family intact. I read it twice. I filed it. Beau, my cousin, had texted me separately just once and said, Elle, I think what Grandpa did was right, and I'm sorry I didn't say that in the room. You deserved that. I had cried in the parking lot of a gas station when I got that text. I am not ashamed of it. Deb had come over the Friday I got back with a bottle of wine and a rotisserie chicken, and we had sat at my kitchen table and I had told her everything. The letter, the folder, the promissory note, my mother's face at the diner. Deb said, so what do you want? I said, I want it to be over. She said, be more specific. I thought about it, and what I told her that night was this. I did not want revenge. I want to be careful about that, because revenge is the satisfying word, the word that feels true when you are in the middle of something like this. But it wasn't accurate. What I wanted was acknowledgement. I wanted what my grandfather had given me in that letter, the experience of being seen, documented, confirmed. I wanted the truth to exist in the world somewhere, fully formed, not as a feeling I had carried in silence for 31 years, but as a thing that had happened, that was on record, that could not be argued away. And I wanted to honor what my grandfather had built. He had spent decades in commercial real estate. He had been careful with money. He had made something, and he had given it to me, not because he pitied me, but because he had watched me, and he believed in what he saw. That mattered. I was not going to dissolve it. Deb poured more wine and said, okay, so what does that look like? I said, I think I need to go back. One more time, all of them in a room, and I think I need Harold. She said, when? The hearing for the estate is in 2 weeks, I said. If anyone's going to contest the will formally, they have to file before then. I think I need to get ahead of it. Deb looked at me for a moment. She had a way of looking at you that felt like being read, not uncomfortably, just accurately. She said, you've been thinking about this for a while. My whole life, I said. I just didn't know what I was thinking about it for. The call from my Uncle Greg came 4 days before the hearing. I was at work, which is where I was when things seemed to arrive all at once. Certified letters, difficult calls, moments that required sitting still while something large rearranged itself. I excused myself from a meeting and took it in the hallway. Greg said, Eleanor, I think you should know that your mother has spoken to an attorney. A pause. A different one. About contesting the will. I said, I know. She's been gathering statements, he said, from people who knew your grandfather, about his mental state in the last few years. I kept my voice even. Okay. I'm not. He stopped. Greg was not a man who found words easily. He was a practical, physical man who had spent his career in construction and dealt in specifics. He said, "I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because Renata and I have talked about this, and we don't think it's right, what's happening. We don't think Raymond was confused. We think he knew exactly what he was doing." I said, "Greg." And then I didn't know what to say next, because Greg had never done anything kind for me, had never been anything other than absent and indifferent. And here he was on a phone call that was costing him something. I said, "Thank you for telling me." "There's something else," he said. "Your mother has been talking to Marcus and Daniel about what to tell the judge if it goes that far, and she said some things about you that," another stop, "that aren't true. About why you left home, about things she says happened." I felt the cold come into my chest. "What things?" "She said you stole from the family when you left." The silence in that hallway was enormous. I said, "She said I stole." "I know," Greg said. "I know that's not—" "I don't believe it, Eleanor. I wanted you to know it was being said." I thanked him. I hung up. I stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand and the distant sound of a printer running somewhere down the corridor, and I thought, she has nothing. She has no case, and she knows she has no case, so she is building a different story. A story where I am the bad actor, where I am the one who corrupted an old man or stole from the family or cannot be trusted. I thought, I have the folder. I have the promissory note. I have 22 years of being the one who did nothing wrong and received nothing for it. And I thought, she is afraid. She is genuinely afraid. And fear makes people do things they would not do from a position of strength, which did not make it okay, but it made it comprehensible. And comprehensible, I could work with. I called Harold from the parking lot after work. I said, "I think we need to change our approach. I think we need to be proactive." He said, "Tell me what you're thinking." I said, "I want everyone in the room before the hearing, not at the courthouse, at the house. I want to give my mother and my brothers a chance to look at the documents and make a decision before this becomes a public legal contest." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a generous offer." "It's not generous," I said. "It's strategic, and it's what he would have wanted." "I meant my grandfather." Another pause. Then Harold said, "I'll make the calls." The storm came the night before, and by the morning of the meeting, it had settled into a steady, serious rain. I drove to Harwick Lane in the gray morning light. The trees along the road bent slightly from the overnight wind. The gravel drive wet and shining. The iron gate was exactly as it always was, half open. It had always been half open. I had never known if that was neglect or intention. I had been in the house twice since the reading. Once to meet Harold for an inventory. Once to stand in my grandfather's study and look at his desk and his books and his collection of small things. The globe paperweight, the brass letter opener, the 3 framed photographs on the corner of the desk. I had looked at those photographs for a long time. One was of my grandmother, who had died before I was old enough to know her. One was of the family at some formal gathering I didn't recognize, everyone 10 or 15 years younger. And one, and this was the one that had made me stand very still in that quiet study, was of me. A photograph of me, alone. Probably taken at some family event when I was about 15. I was looking off to the side, not at the camera. I looked like what I was, a kid who was used to not being the center of things, a kid who had learned to find her own field of vision. My grandfather had framed it and put it on his desk. He had kept a photograph of me on his desk. I had stood there a long time with that. Now the house was filling up again. Harold arrived before any of the family, and we set up at the dining room table, the same brass lamp, the same William Morris wallpaper. Harold put the documents in 2 neat piles in front of him. I sat at the end opposite where Harold would sit. I had thought about where to sit. I had decided to sit where my grandfather always sat, at the head of the table. Not out of arrogance, out of intention. They came in over 20 minutes. My mother with that controlled face again. Marcus, who looked like he hadn't slept. Daniel, who looked like he had decided something and then undecided it. Aunt Renata, with red eyes. Uncle Greg, who caught my eye and gave me a single nod. Bo, who sat close to me without making a show of it. When everyone was seated, Harold said, "Thank you for coming. I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting. Eleanor has asked me to facilitate an informal discussion before the estate hearing on Friday. No decisions need to be made today, but I want to share some information that I believe all of you should have." My mother said, "Harold, I want you to know we have retained separate counsel. Of course, Harold said. That is your right. He opened the first pile of documents. I'm going to show you a summary of financial transfers from Raymond's accounts over the past 9 years, which were documented in his personal records and are part of the estate inventory. He placed printed copies in front of each person. The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at his sheet. He said nothing. His jaw tightened. My mother said, "These are private family matters. They are a matter of estate record," Harold said, with exactly no heat in his voice. "The transfers are fully legal and are not in dispute. What I want to bring to your attention is their cumulative nature." He paused. Over 9 years, Raymond provided financial support totaling approximately $210,000 to members of this family. That support was extended to Catherine, my mother, to Marcus, and to Daniel. It was not extended to Eleanor. Daniel said quietly, "He chose to do that." "Yes," Harold said, "just as he chose to structure his estate as he did." Then he placed the second set of documents. The promissory note, copies for everyone. My mother's composure did not break, but something happened in her face, a tightening, a stillness that I recognized as the moment before the story changes. Harold said, "This is a promissory note dated 5 years ago for a loan of $50,000 from Raymond's personal account to Catherine Ashworth. The loan was forgiven in the estate, which was his right. However, the terms of forgiveness required disclosure in the estate proceedings. We have not yet received that disclosure." The silence was different from the first one. The first silence at the reading had been shock. This silence was something else. This was the silence of a room full of people recalculating. Marcus said slowly, "Mom, is this real?" My mother said, "It was a private arrangement." "Mom." Marcus's voice had changed. "Is this real?" She said, "Raymond understood. He agreed." Harold said, "He did agree. And he documented it, as you can see. The question before us is how the family would like to proceed, given that a formal contest of the will would make all of this documentation part of the public court record." Another silence, and in that silence, I spoke for the first time. I said, "I want to be very clear about something." My voice was steady. I had been practicing this in my head for 2 weeks, but I found I didn't need the rehearsal. The words came from somewhere older than planning. I am not doing this to hurt anyone. Grandpa built something over 40 years. He worked for it. He thought about what to do with it for a long time, and he made a decision that was legal and documented and witnessed. I am going to honor that decision. Not because I'm trying to take something from anyone, but because he asked me to, and because he trusted me to. I looked at my mother. I know things have not been easy. I know the last few weeks have been frightening. I understand why. I paused. But I am not going to sign anything that dissolves what he built. And I am asking you, all of you, to please let this be what it is. Marcus was looking at the table. Daniel had his hands pressed together in front of him. Renata was quietly crying again. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Her face was doing something I had not seen it do before, working towards something. I watched her arrive at a decision. She said, "If we accept the will as written, the promissory note, the disclosure issue, does that go away?" Harold said, "That would be a matter for the estate proceedings. But yes, in general terms, if there is no contest, the records become less prominent." She said, "I would need that in writing." Harold said, "Of course." My mother looked at me again, and I will tell you something about that moment that I have turned over many times since. I did not feel triumph. I felt tired. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. She said, "Eleanor," a pause, "I'm sorry." She said it the way someone says something they mean, but do not know how to mean, like the words are being learned as they are being spoken. I know that it doesn't cover everything. I know it doesn't cover what I should have. I know it's not enough. Her voice caught, just slightly, but I am sorry. I looked at her, my mother, in the amber light of that lamp, in the rain-gray morning of that colonial house, the woman who had walked past the permission slip, who had told me there was probably nothing left in the will, who had said at a diner that if I loved my family, I would sign the paper. I said, "Thank you." That was all, and I meant it. The estate hearing was 3 days later, on a Friday morning, at the county courthouse. My mother did not contest the will. Neither did Marcus or Daniel. Harold filed the necessary paperwork, the estate moved into its processing period, and the judge accepted the documentation without incident. I drove home that afternoon in the same car with the cracked windshield and the rattle in the exhaust. I had the folder in my bag, the letter from my grandfather in a separate envelope in my coat pocket, the business card of a property management company Harold had recommended for the commercial property, and a photograph, the one from my grandfather's desk, the one of me at 15 looking off to the side, which I had wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth and put in the back seat. The drive home was 4 hours. I stopped once at a diner outside the county and had coffee and eggs and sat in a booth by the window and watched the parking lot for a while. The rain had finally, fully stopped. The sky was doing what skies do in November when the storm breaks, going this particular shade of silver white that makes everything look very clear and very cold and very still. I thought about my grandfather sitting alone at the end of that Easter table. The way he had said, "You notice things. That's a skill. Don't let anyone take it from you." I thought about how long he had been watching, how carefully he had prepared, how he had written my name in an address book with the word "C's" beside it, and then carried that with him for 20 years. I thought about something he'd written in the letter that I haven't told you yet. Near the end of it, he wrote, "I want to say one more thing, and I want you to hear it as clearly as I can say it. You have nothing to prove. You never did. Whatever happens with what I'm leaving you, house, money, property, none of it changes what was already true before you opened this letter. You have always been enough. The work you did to build your life when no one was helping you, when no one was even looking, that is not a consolation prize. That is the whole story. The inheritance is just the acknowledgement, the whole story." I sat with my eggs and my coffee in that diner, and I thought about what the next year would look like, the decisions I would have to make about the house, whether to keep it or sell it or do something else entirely, the property management, the investment accounts, all the practical things that come with inheriting something real. But underneath all of that, something else, something simpler. I had been given the thing I had always needed, and it had not come in the form I expected. It had not come as a phone call or a birthday acknowledgement or a mother who saw me clearly. It had come as an old man who wrote a word in an address book and kept a photograph on his desk and spent 20 years paying quiet attention. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Here is what happened afterward, in the months that followed the hearing. The estate cleared probate in late spring. The house on Harwick Lane became mine officially on a Tuesday in April, when Harold called me at my desk at work and said, "It's done, Eleanor." I sat there with the phone in my hand for a moment, looking at the plain gray wall of my office, and I said, "Okay, just that. I did not sell the house. I want to tell you why, because I think it matters." The house was worth a lot of money, and the practical choice, the financially sensible choice, would have been to sell it and put the money somewhere smarter. But I thought about the William Morris wallpaper. I thought about the wraparound porch and the iron gate and the amber light from the brass lamp. I thought about the study and the 3 photographs on the desk. And I thought about a man who had built something over 40 years and cared enough about what happened to it that he spent the last chapter of his life making sure it went to the right place. I decided to renovate it slowly and move in. I gave myself 18 months. I hired a local contractor who had done work in the neighborhood for years and who, on our first walkthrough, ran his hand along the William Morris wallpaper and said, "This is beautiful work. You don't see this anymore." I said, "I know. I want to keep it." The commercial property stayed as it was. The tenants had been there for years, and they were good tenants, and they deserved the stability. And the income they generated was reliable, and I had no intention of disrupting it. The investment accounts I left with a financial advisor Harold recommended. A woman in her 50s who wore glasses on a chain around her neck and spoke in plain, sensible sentences and did not condescend. She and I sat down and talked for 2 hours, and she said, "What are you hoping this money does for you?" And I said, "I want it to give me options. I want to be able to make choices without fear." She said, "That's a good answer." And she went to work. My mother and I did not immediately repair things. I want to be honest about that because I think the dishonest version of this story would have a moment of tearful reconciliation, arms around each other in the hallway of the old house, everything made right. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and less satisfying and more real. We had lunch together once, about 4 months after the hearing, at the same diner on Route 9, which was strange, but neither of us mentioned it. She was different, not radically different, not transformed, but there were things she said that she had not said before. She asked about my work. She asked if I was happy in the apartment. She said carefully, "I've been thinking about some things." I said, "Me too." We did not have the conversation, not that day. But the lunch lasted 2 hours, which was longer than any conversation we had had in memory, and when we got up to leave, she hugged me, a real hug, not the half-second kind, and she said, "I'll call you." She did call, not every week, but she did call. Marcus and I remained distant. There was too much said in that room, and between Marcus and me, there was also too much unsaid for too many years. We exchanged texts at holidays, polite, brief, the texts of people who share history but not closeness. I did not grieve this. I had accepted at some point in those 2 weeks between the letter and the hearing that not all damage is repairable. Some of it is just true. Daniel surprised me. About 6 months after everything, he called, not a text, an actual call, and asked if he could come see the house sometime. He said, "I want to understand it better." Him. He meant our grandfather. I said yes. He came on a Saturday in October, and we walked through the house together, and I showed him the study, and he stood in front of the 3 photographs on the desk for a long time. He didn't say much. At the end of the visit, at the front door, he said, "I think I've been someone I didn't want to be." I said, "I think we all have been, in different ways." He nodded, and then he left. That was not a resolution, but it was something. Beau came to visit too, and that was easier, because Beau had never had anything to prove with me, and we spent an afternoon on the wraparound porch with takeout coffee, and he told me about his life in Phoenix, and I told him about the renovation plans, and it felt, for a few hours, like what family is supposed to feel like. Easy, without agenda. Uncle Greg and Aunt Renata sent a plant for the new house. It was a large, flourishing spider plant in a clay pot with a card that said, "For the new chapter." I put it in the front window where the light was good. Harold Finch became something I did not expect, a friend, or something close to one. We had coffee every few weeks when I was in Harwick County for the renovation, and he told me things about my grandfather, small things, the texture of a man's life, that I had not known, that he had loved baseball, that he had read a particular mystery series every summer for 20 years, that he had cried once at Harold's desk when he was changing the will, and then straightened up and said, "All right, let's get to it." Harold told me that story, the way you tell a story about someone you respected enormously and miss. I kept the address book. I found it in the desk drawer during the inventory, exactly where I expected it to be. I opened it and found my name, and beside it, in my grandfather's small, precise handwriting, the word "Seize." I put it on my desk. I moved into the house on Harwick Lane on a Saturday in May, 14 months after the reading. The contractor and his crew had done beautiful work. The William Morris wallpaper was cleaned and repaired in the places that had been peeling. The floors were refinished. The kitchen was updated without losing its character. The study was untouched. I had specifically asked for the study to stay exactly as it was. The morning I moved in, I made coffee and brought it to the wraparound porch and sat in one of the old wooden chairs and listened to the neighborhood. Birds, someone's lawnmower 2 streets over, a car pulling out of a driveway, the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning. I thought about what my grandfather had written, the whole story. I have thought about that phrase many times since then, and here is what I have come to believe. The whole story, the one that matters, is not the inheritance. The inheritance is the acknowledgement, like he said. The whole story is what I built while no one was looking. The skills I developed because I had to. The patience, the capacity to observe and wait and not be undone by being overlooked. Those things were forged in the specific kiln of my childhood, and even if I would not have chosen to be forged there, they are mine. They are real. They are the reason my grandfather trusted me with what he built. He saw someone who would not mistake money for love and would not be undone by it. He was right. I haven't been. The cracked windshield is fixed, by the way. I mention this because it seems right to mention it. The small practical thing that I had been putting off for longer than I should have, finally done. I drove to the shop on a Tuesday, and they replaced it in 2 hours, and I picked it up in the late afternoon, and the glass was clean and clear, and catching the light in a simple, unbroken way, and I thought, yes, like that. I still work at the architecture firm, though I've been considering options. There is a scholarship I want to establish, for students in the county who qualify for financial aid but fall through the cracks. I've been talking to a foundation about it. The name is not yet decided. I am thinking about what my grandfather would have called it. I am thinking C's, but that might be too small, too private. I'll figure it out. What I know for certain is this. I was shorted. Year after year, in the small currency of daily life, I was shorted. And I built a life anyway. And one day, the universe handed me the evidence. Not that I was right exactly, but that I had been real. That someone had been paying attention. That being overlooked is not the same as being invisible. Not the same at all. I want to leave you with one last image, because I think it carries something I can't quite say directly. About 3 weeks after I moved in, I was in the study, his study, my study now, going through a last box of things that hadn't been sorted yet. Old correspondence, some financial folders, a few books that had been on a shelf in the closet. At the bottom of the box was a manila envelope, plain, unsealed, with my name on it in his handwriting. No note, no explanation. I had not seen it in any of the inventory. Inside was a collection of things he had saved. A report card from my 4th grade year, the one where my teacher had written in the comments, "Eleanor is a remarkably self-possessed child who notices more than she lets on." I don't know how he had gotten it. A small newspaper clipping from the local paper near my college about a community event I had organized in my sophomore year. A neighborhood cleanup that had gotten a 3-paragraph mention on page 8. I didn't remember anyone from home knowing about this. A printout of an email I had sent him once. I had forgotten this entirely, when I was about 25. A brief email to his address that I had found somewhere in old family papers, on the off chance it still worked. I had said something like, "Grandpa, I don't know if this address is current. I just wanted to say hello. I think about you sometimes. I hope you're doing well." No response had come, and I had assumed the address was dead, but he had printed it out, and he had saved it. And at the very bottom of the envelope, a photograph I had never seen. Me, again. But younger than the one on the desk. I must have been 4 or 5. I was sitting on the front porch of a house I didn't recognize, looking at something off camera, my face entirely absorbed by whatever I was watching. And behind me, just visible in the doorway, was my grandfather. He was looking at me with an expression I could not quite name, but I knew what it contained. The same word he had written in the address book, C's. He had been watching since the beginning, and he had kept what he found. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time. The afternoon light came through the windows, the way afternoon light does in May when the trees are full and the air is still, green and gold and generous. The spider plant in the front window was visible from where I sat. The 3 photographs were on the desk above me, in their places. I thought about all the people who are sitting in rooms somewhere, carrying the permission slip that nobody signed, carrying the birthday that nobody called, carrying the small accumulated weight of being the one who doesn't quite count. And I want to say something to them, because I think my grandfather, if he were here, would want me to. You are being watched, not by surveillance, by love, by the quiet attention of at least one person who sees, even if they haven't yet said so. And your job, your only job, really, is to keep going. Not because the recognition will come, because maybe it won't, maybe not in the way you imagine, but because the life you build in the absence of recognition is real, and it belongs to you, and no one can take it. And if you're lucky, one day the record will surface. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. I'll see you in the next story.